Hello, my name is Robert M. Ross and I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the state of Pennsylvania, and I'd like to welcome you back to my channel, which is called The Common Sense Lifestyle. In my channel here, I try to break down simple psychological concepts into little chunks of information, or wisdom as you like to put it, that you could use to make your life just a little bit better. So before we get into today's topic, I want to give my standard disclaimer. I am not your therapist. This is not a therapy session. Nothing in any of my videos should be construed as being to diagnose or treat any kind of condition of any kind. If you do need a therapist, I would encourage you to contact your insurance company. They would be able to find someone in network in your area, or you could use Psychology Today's Find a Therapist function, and that tends to work rather well. So let's get into our topic today. Topic for today is what I like to call default settings. And what are default settings? Default settings are basically your way of looking at the world, your way of coping with the world, your automatic way of doing things. So just to kind of explain where these come from, how these come about, we're born as humans being completely helpless. We're born empty. We have no ideas in our head. We have no concepts. We're not born with a political orientation or anything like that. We're born in a state of what the Latin is tabula rasa, or blank slate. We're just an empty tablet. We're an empty book. And it is up to the people around us and the society and culture around us to fill that book up with information that allows us to become a useful human being, at least in terms of what that society expects. So again, consequently, we're born without ideas. However, in the first 6 years of life, first 5 or 6 years, depending on who you listen to, we learn more than we do for the rest of our lives combined. We learn from our parents, our older siblings, our extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and we start to learn. And the things that we learn are very basic nuts and bolts, how to be a human being kind of stuff. How do we treat others? How do we get our needs met? What are the roles? What's expected of us? How do people and families function? What do people do in response to one another? How do we treat each other? How do we interact? And these things are learned by observation, not by direct instruction. Most of what we learn during that time frame is learned by watching the people around us. And we just kind of soak that in because, again, we're born blank slate. There's nothing in our heads. We have to learn by watching, and we just soak all this stuff in. And it's not a lesson, so it's not even something that we're really conscious of. We just learn and do. Now, as we get older, and we start to have more interactions with the outside world, external to our families, these messages that we learn either get reinforced or changed or altered. We end up watching television shows. Television shows have messages. How do we learn things? For example, a kid of my age, or folks even older than me, they grew up watching cowboy shows where there was a good guy and a bad guy, and the good guy always won, and the good guy had certain qualities that were to be emulated. These were default settings for a lot of people. Movies, same kind of thing. What are we getting from our media? What are we putting into our heads? And that's going to come up a little bit more later. Music, what do the sappy love songs teach us? What does that show us about how the world is supposed to be and how we're supposed to go about ourselves in this world? And then we go to school. And then we start to have influences from peers and teachers and other people such as that. And we start to soak in more information there. So again, we're having our heads pumped full of information on how we're supposed to act, feel, do in specific situations and roles. And it basically teaches us how to be. These are our default settings. This is what we come into the world with as we hit adulthood and beyond. This is how life is supposed to be. This is what we're supposed to do. And you just automatically go and do it. Now, let's break it down a little bit more. Let's say you have a quote-unquote boring childhood. Let's say you grew up in an intact family and your parents didn't drink or drug or beat on each other, and they were supportive and respectful of each other. You're going to grow up with some default settings that, you pretty much know how to go. you're not going to have a whole lot of problems, hopefully. You may, but you may not have a whole lot of problems because you have stability, you have a sense of cooperation, you have a sense of mutual respect, and things like that. That's probably going to help you pretty well. Now, if you have a less than boring childhood, as I like to put it, you're going to have a little bit more of a difficult time. And here's just some basic generic examples. Let's say you had an abusive parent, whether it was the mother or the father or both, and they were beating up on each other. Do you grow up with the default setting that when you have a conflict with somebody, you beat the snot out of them? A lot of people do. That's why violence and domestic violence and things like that tend to get perpetuated through family lines. The children grow up watching the other family members do this, and they grow up thinking it's normal. This is what you do. Um, you see that with women with quote unquote daddy issues. They grew up with a father that was absent or abusive, and they think that's how men are supposed to be, and they get into bad relationships. Not every woman, but many of them, and enough to know that we know that there's a trend there. We get used to everything being unfair. Let's say a sibling gets everything and you get nothing. You're going to get some default settings out of that. If you grew up with a single mom, and single mom had what I call the man of the month club, where, different month, different boyfriend, and sometimes they move in and kids get attached and then that guy's gone and the next guy's in and blah, 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 blah. What does that teach kids about relationships? What does that teach kids about stability? Teaches some pretty bad messages, actually. What if you do fine at home, but then you get to school and get bullied really badly? That gives you some additional default settings. What if you grew up around people that are drinking, drugging, smoking, whatever else? You're going to grow up thinking that's what people do. I always tell parents, avoid what I call hypocrisy problems. You can't sit there and say, you better not smoke, kid. Smoking's bad for you. You're going to be in trouble if you catch smoking. Guess what? Your kid's probably going to smoke. You know why? Because his default setting is that's what men do because he's watching you do it. Same thing with drinking. If you're drinking and drugging in front of your kids, don't be surprised when they drink and drug themselves because you're teaching them to drink and drug. It's becoming their default setting because you're teaching them that. So different things. And I could go on about this all day. I mean, there's 1,000,005 different ways I could go with that. But hopefully you're just getting the basic idea that what you see and what you experience growing up shapes your view of what quote unquote normal is. So just go with that. Now, if your default settings are unfavorable, you're going to have a difficult time getting along in the world. If your default setting is that you're no good or worthless, let's say your parents mistreated you or you were bullied in school or both, which certainly can happen, you're probably going to have self-concept problems. You're not going to think very highly of yourself. And if you don't think very highly of yourself, maybe you're not going to go for the schooling that you could be successful in, but you don't think you can, so you don't. Or you won't apply for the job that would make you decent money because you don't think you can do it and you're not good enough, so you don't. People end up becoming self-limiting because of their default settings. If your default settings involve being entitled to whatever you want, whenever you want it, some kids grow up being overindulged, spoiled, as you might say. Or even worse, if they grow up thinking that they should never be offended. Reality is going to give those people a very, very rude awakening because they're going to find out at some point in the future that reality just doesn't care about their feelings. And not everyone is going to indulge them the way their parents did. And, that I've seen adults throw temper tantrums, basically, because they're not getting their way because mommy and daddy always gave in when I yelled and screamed and stomped my feet. Why aren't these people giving in? And, some of them encounter police officers and they're really frustrated when the police officer doesn't give in when they yell and scream and stomp their feet and instead put handcuffs on them. So, have to take a look at that. If your default setting is to be the good man slash nice guy slash provider guy, and you're taught to live by the saying, happy wife, happy life, I've run into a ton of guys that were raised that way and that's their default setting and they're getting eaten up and chewed out in bad marriages because what we're seeing more and more of is that way of thinking just doesn't match reality, but it's a default setting for many, many men. So that's something that, you know, we get into a lot in therapy. And there's, again, a million different ways I can look at this, million different ways I could approach it. Could be here all day, but don't want to make a 6-hour video. So we'll just keep on moving. Here's an example of default settings run awry, and it's just from a couple weeks ago. A gentleman down in Australia encountered a woman who was broken down. Apparently, she had a car accident of some kind. Her car was disabled. So his default setting was to always help a stranger, help, you know, especially a female. And he stopped and he did a makeshift repair on her car enough that she could get it to wherever she was going. And they went their separate ways. And then he was arrested because the woman accused him of sexually assaulting her or sexual harassment or something like that. Man ended up going to a maximum security prison for 2 weeks. His wife is divorcing him. He's lost his job. I believe he was a father, and more than likely he does not have custody of his son at this point because of this accusation. But here's the snag. Well, here, and the snag in his favor, where he was and where he assisted this young woman, there was a surveillance camera there, and the entire interaction was caught start to finish on surveillance camera. And the surveillance camera footage shows that he did absolutely nothing inappropriate. And in fact, when he successfully repaired the woman's car, the woman came and hugged him and thanked him. When confronted with the footage, the woman recanted and changed her story. But still, this man's life is essentially ruined because anytime he looks for another job, because he did lose his job, anytime he looks for another job, he's going to come up as being accused of sexual assault. Now, yes, he was found, you know, to not have done anything wrong, and that his exoneration is going to be in the search results too. But more than likely, the first thing that's going to come up is accused of sexual assault, and his picture is going to be right there. His default setting got him into trouble in this situation, and he has basically said that in the future he's going to be very hesitant to stop and help anyone if they're stuck alongside the road. And, you know, this is why we can't have nice things. You know, his default setting was to assist, and that default setting got him thrown into prison for something he didn't do. So that's, you know, default settings, even when they're quote unquote socially good, can be terrible, depending on the culture and the reality. And in a rapidly changing culture that we're in, a lot of old default settings that were perfectly appropriate and perfectly normal in the past are completely unacceptable now. So you have to kind of recondition yourself to cope with that. So when our default settings are destructive or they just don't match reality, we stand to have problems in our lives, whether they're destructive or even supposedly helpful. But just like our computers, we can change our default settings. So you buy a new computer, you buy a new phone, anything like that, any new piece of tech. It will come out of the factory with its default settings, all the settings that the factory set. You can go in with a few mouse clicks and change those settings to whatever you want. You can change the graphics, you can change the color scheme, you can change the printers, you can change pretty much anything you want to on the computer, or at least in terms of the appearance and functionality. But our minds are a bit more complex than Windows 10 or Linux or whatever you're using, so it takes more than just a few clicks to change our default settings. So how do we do that? Well, first off, we question everything. And we usually question things after something has failed or we've had a disaster in our lives. There has been a bad breakup, there's a divorce. The gentleman in Australia who was arrested for helping someone. Things like that. You have something terrible happen in your life. It causes you to question yourself. It causes you to, like, am I the problem? And sometimes you are the problem, and sometimes you need to take a look at you and see what factor you had in whatever disasters unfolded for you. You can read books. A frequent book that I have guys read that have maybe what we call nice guy syndrome is No More Mr. Nice Guy by Dr. Robert Glover. Awesome book. It has changed the lives of many men. And a lot of guys that I've had read that book, they've reread that book many times over simply because it has made such an impact, and every time they read it, they get a little bit more out of it. Watch what you put into your brain is another useful thing, and it's like maybe that's our saying for today is watch what you put into your brain. Now, when you're a baby and you're little and you're a toddler, you can't help but what's put in your brain because your family's just there and that's what's being put into your brain. But as an adult, you have a lot of control over what you're putting into your head. Um, if you watch TV shows, movies, listen to music, read books that reinforce destructive default thinking, then you probably want to cut those things out. You probably want to put things into your head that are helpful, that are affirming, that contribute to having a healthier mindset, to give yourself a greater sense of well being. For myself, for example, I haven't had cable or satellite since 2012, and I haven't missed it a bit. I'm not funding channels that I disagree with because basically when you purchase cable or satellite, you're funding channels that you probably don't like, but you're forced to pay for them. So you're paying the salaries of the people that probably don't like you. So don't pay them. And don't pay them to pump information into your head that's not good for you. It's not good for you mentally. It's not good for you spiritually even. So watch what you put into your head. If you agree or you want to improve yourself, watch shows about self-improvement. If you're interested in eating clean or exercise or fixing cars or things like that, watch shows that build on you. Watch programming. If you're interested in histories, watch documentaries. There's 1,000,005 things that you can watch that isn't garbage and is going to expand your mind and not diminish it. So definitely, take a look at the media you consume. A lot of times negative messages appear in songs, in books. Watch what you consume. Watch what you put into your head. I always tell people if you don't want to have nightmares, don't watch scary movies before you go to bed. It's as simple as that sometimes. It's if you read books about how to be the worst possible human being, and believe it or not, there are books out there like that. You're going to become worse. Other thing, reevaluate your relationships. Who are your friends? Do your friends uplift you? Do they push you forward? Are they positive influences on you, or are they sitting in their parents' basements covered in Cheeto dust because they play video games all day? You know, have friends that are going somewhere. Have friends that are doing something. Have friends that are a positive pull and influence on you, and you're going to go in the same direction they're going, and you're going to help them as well. It's a reciprocal relationship. Same thing with romances, romantic involvements, girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever. Have relationships with people that are good to you. Do not tolerate abuse. I've done multiple videos on how to identify and deal with abusers in relationships. And Jeff, definitely watch those and watch out for those red flags. Don't have someone in your life who's toxic. Don't have someone in your life who drags you down. Don't have people in your life that are nasty to you. If they are, get rid of them. And sometimes, and this is a hard one, but sometimes the nasty people are parents or sisters or brothers, and you have to discard them from your life because they're toxic to you. And sometimes they're the reason you have the nasty default settings that you're trying to get rid of and work on anyway. So, sometimes that's the hard call that people have to make. It's unfortunate, but it's better to get rid of toxic people from your life than have them there, even if they're mom or dad or sister or brother. Look at your work. Are you working in an environment that's building you? Are you learning anything in this job? Are you growing in this job? Are you progressing so you can get a better job from this job? Don't stay in a job where you're being abused or exploited. I've dealt with situations or seen situations where, supervisors go and yell and scream at staff people and they're verbally abusive. Don't stay in a job like that. You don't need that. If you stay in that job, you have Stockholm Syndrome, and you can look that up on your own time. Don't stay in jobs where you're being exploited. If you're there to gain some experience, you can move on to the next job. I get that. But I know people that get out of school and an employer just takes advantage of them and just drastically underpays them, barely pays the minimum wage for having an advanced degree or something like that. Absolutely insane. Don't stay in a job like that. Don't allow yourself to be exploited. Move on to something better and bigger, something that serves your purposes. Because if you're in a job that's nasty and doesn't treat you well, it's reinforcing bad default messages. It's or giving you more bad default messages like I can't do any better than this. This is the best I can do. No, no, it's not. Forget that bad default message. Question everything. Move on. Do something better. But the key for all of this to work, you have to embrace the idea that change can actually occur. And that's where a lot of people struggle. A lot of people have the default setting. A lot of people have the default setting that they can't change. A lot of people have the default setting that things can't ever get better. A lot of people have the default setting that, I'm always going to be this way because that's what they were taught. If you're taught that you're always a failure, always been a failure, always gonna be a failure, yeah, you're gonna stay that way if you believe it. But if you embrace change, you're gonna be able to move forward. Many times, especially if your default settings are destructive, you may need to have a therapist to help you sort out your thoughts and come up with alternatives. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just find a therapist that believes in change because there are therapists anymore, and I've encountered them. They've adopted a very deterministic kind of view that once you're a certain way, you're always going to be a certain way. And I kind of find that related to a victim mentality or a hopelessness mentality that I don't particularly subscribe to or like. I believe the power of the individual to change. And I've seen incredible stories of change. I've seen people that have been through horrific, horrific abuse. And something in their head clicks and they say, no more, I'm never going to live like this again. And they don't. They change. They struggle because their default settings are terrible. And one of the things that happens to folks with default settings is they don't quite know what normal is. And they know what they don't want to do, but they don't know what to do instead. So they struggle. But again, that's when you can have a therapist and they can help you sort those kinds of things out. But I have seen people overcome incredibly terrible things and do exceptionally well. And you have to have the confidence that you can do that as well, because once you do, anything is possible for you. Change is possible, success is possible, love is possible, anything. The world is open to you. So just embrace that. So guys, in the end, just be aware of your default settings. Watch what you put into your head. If you have any questions, comments, throw them in the comments down below. Hit the like and subscribe and hit the bell so when I get put out future videos, you'll be made aware of those. As always, guys, I want to give out the suicide prevention hotline down in the description below. If you, a friend or a family member is expressing suicidal thoughts, don't hesitate to use that number. Most things get better. Most things can change. Most things can improve. It may seem terrible now, but most things are temporary. Don't make suicide your long-term solution to a short-term problem. Otherwise, guys, have a great day. Watch what you put into your heads. Be aware of your default settings. Have a great one, guys.